Story number 1. The Shadows of Denali. There are places on this earth that humans were never meant to go. Places that carry a weight in the air so thick you feel it in your bones. Denali National Park in Alaska is one of those places. I didn't know it back in December of 2004, but I was about to learn that some mysteries are better left unexplored. It was supposed to be an adventure. I still remember the excitement in Matt's voice when he called me a few weeks before Christmas. "Come on, Pete, we've been talking about this for years. Let's make it happen." Denali, snow camping, the works. His enthusiasm was infectious, and before long, our friend Travis had signed on too. We were a trio with a history of hiking and camping, but nothing like this. Denali was wild, untamed, and deadly in winter. That was part of the allure. We reached the park 2 days before Christmas. The drive itself felt like a journey into another world. Vast expanses of white stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by the jagged peaks of mountains that loomed like sentinels. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath our boots as we set up camp. The first night was uneventful. We huddled around a small fire, laughing and swapping stories. The cold was biting, but we were prepared, or so we thought. As the hours passed, a sense of unease began to creep into my mind. It was subtle at first, a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The wind whistled through the trees in strange patterns, almost like whispers, but I dismissed it as my imagination running wild. On the second night, the storm rolled in. The wind picked up, howling like a wounded animal, and the snow came down in thick, blinding sheets. We were forced to take shelter in our tents, and any thoughts of adventure were replaced by the sheer fight to stay warm and dry. The hours dragged by, punctuated only by the occasional sound of snow shifting outside. At some point in the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but they grew louder, circling our camp. I held my breath, straining to hear, but when I peered out of the tent, there was nothing, just the swirling snow and the shadows of the forest. "Did you hear that?" Matt's voice startled me. He had unzipped his tent and was looking around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "I thought it was you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Travis stirred in his tent, muttering something about wolves, but Matt and I exchanged a look that said we knew better. This wasn't wildlife. This was something else. By morning, the storm had eased, leaving the world blanketed in an eerie stillness. But there was something wrong. Travis's tent was open, the flap flapping in the breeze, and he was gone. First, we thought he'd wandered off to relieve himself or explore, but as the hours passed, panic set in. His gear was still inside the tent, untouched, and there were no footprints leading away from the camp. None. It was as if he had simply vanished into the snow. Matt and I searched for hours, our shouts swallowed by the endless expanse of white. The storm had erased any trace of where he might have gone, and the deeper into the forest we ventured, the more the unease from the first night returned. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That night, we stayed close to the fire, barely speaking. Every creak of the trees, every gust of wind felt like a warning. And then, just as we were about to retreat to the tents, we heard it. A low, guttural moan echoed through the trees, followed by what sounded like faint laughter. It wasn't human, at least, not entirely. It was distorted, unnatural, as though it came from something trying to mimic the sound of a person. Matt's face went pale, and he clutched the axe he'd been using to chop firewood. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. I didn't argue. We packed what we could and left in the dead of night, our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the darkness. The trail back to the main road was treacherous, and the snow seemed to swallow all sound except for our own hurried footsteps. But the feeling of being followed never left us. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees, just out of sight. When we finally reached the ranger station, We were half frozen and shaking with fear. We reported Travis's disappearance, but the rangers seemed skeptical. They promised to search the area, but their expressions told me they didn't expect to find him. Weeks turned into months, and Travis was never found. Matt and I tried to move on, but the memories of that trip lingered like a bad dream. I stopped hiking altogether, unable to shake the feeling that whatever had taken Travis was still out there, waiting. It wasn't until years later that I came across a forum dedicated to unexplained disappearances in national parks. As I scrolled through the accounts, my blood ran cold. There were others, stories of people vanishing in Denali under eerily similar circumstances. Some mentioned hearing footsteps, others described strange sounds in the night. But the one detail that sent shivers down my spine was this. Several people reported seeing a figure in the distance, tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. I don't know what happened to Travis that night, and I don't think I ever will. But I do know one thing. Denali is not just a park. It's something older, something alive, and it doesn't take kindly to visitors. If you ever find yourself there, especially in the dead of winter, heed my warning. Don't go looking for adventure. You might find more than you bargained for. And whatever you do, don't stay after dark. Because in Denali, the shadows have eyes, and they're always watching. Story number 2. The Silent Watchers. It was supposed to be the perfect Christmas. We were young, carefree, and desperate for adventure. I remember the thrill in our hearts when we packed up the car, throwing our gear into the trunk with the kind of excitement you get when you're about to do something reckless, something that feels like a rite of passage. We were a group of 6 friends, me, Sam, Sarah, Alex, Megan, and Tyler. The plan was simple: a Christmas camping trip in the Colorado wilderness, far away from the noise and clutter of the holidays. We didn't want presents or parties. We wanted solitude, the stillness of the forest, and the crisp air of winter. That was our first mistake. The forest we chose was remote, deep in the heart of the Rockies. No one else was around, just us and the silence. We made camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick trees, the snow fresh and undisturbed, the kind of snow that makes you feel like you're the first person to ever walk here. The sky was clear, and the stars shone brightly above. As we sat around the campfire, we felt invincible. We made jokes, roasted marshmallows, and drank hot cocoa from metal mugs. Christmas was just another day in the wild, a day where we could forget about everything else. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. It wasn't the wind, though the trees swayed in eerie whispers. It wasn't the cold, even though it was biting. It was something else, something watching. The first time we heard it, we thought it was the wind, but then it happened again. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and distant, coming from the woods beyond our campsite. First, we brushed it off, laughing nervously. Probably just a deer, Sam joked, though his voice was shaky. We tried to ignore it. We didn't want to ruin the mood, not when we'd been looking forward to this trip for months. But as the night deepened, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every time I looked into the shadows between the trees, my skin prickled. I couldn't shake the sense that something was out there, waiting, just beyond the firelight. The others must have felt it too, because every now and then, I'd catch one of them glancing into the dark corners of the clearing, their faces pale and tense. The noises kept coming. They weren't close, but they were unmistakable. Footsteps, shifting in the snow, as if something was circling us. Something large, something deliberate. Maybe we should check it out, Tyler said, half joking, but his voice lacked conviction. He had a tendency to act tough, but I could tell he was nervous. The fear in the air was contagious. No, let's just stay put, Alex said, his eyes darting nervously. It's probably nothing. But the feeling didn't go away. It got worse. I don't know what time it was when we all finally turned in for the night. We huddled together in our tents, the wind howling through the trees, but the sound of footsteps didn't stop. If anything, It seemed to get closer. Couldn't sleep. I kept tossing and turning, my heart racing in my chest. Every little sound made me jump. I kept imagining someone or something standing just outside the tent, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. My breath caught in my throat, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew it wasn't just the wind anymore. It was real. Around 3 a.m., I finally couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent flap and stepped out into the cold, hoping that seeing the forest in daylight would put my mind at ease. I should never have done that. The camp was completely still, too still. The fire was nothing but a few dying embers, casting long, twisted shadows across the snow. The footprints were still there, but they weren't the same ones I had seen earlier. These were fresh, almost as if someone had circled the camp just minutes before. They were deep in the snow, as though the person or thing that made them weighed far more than any of us. I felt a cold chill grip my spine. I turned back toward the tents, my mind racing. Why hadn't anyone else woken up? I crept back inside, trying not to wake the others, but it was impossible. My mind was racing too fast. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. The footsteps, how they came closer each time, how they seemed to move with purpose, with intelligence. Whoever or whatever was out there, it wasn't just an animal. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening to the sounds of the forest, the creaking trees, the wind, the snow falling. But I also heard something else, something strange, a whispering, coming from the woods. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't even a language I could understand. It sounded like something far older than humanity, something that had been in the forest long before we ever set foot there. When morning finally came, we were all exhausted. No one had slept much, and we all looked pale and shaken. I couldn't shake the feeling that the night had been more than just a bad dream. Something had been out there. Something had been watching us. But the worst part was what we found when we woke up. Our tent was torn open, not ripped, but slashed, as if something had come from the inside and torn through the fabric with savage precision. The gear inside was thrown around like someone had been looking for something, searching for something, but there were no signs of struggle, no signs of anyone else being there, no footprints around the tent, nothing. We all stood frozen, staring at the destruction. "What the hell happened?" Megan whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "But I'm not staying here to find out." None of us said anything. We didn't need to. We packed up in silence, hurriedly stuffing everything into our bags, not daring to linger a moment longer than necessary. But as we made our way out of the clearing, I glanced back one last time, and for a moment, I swear I saw something moving in the trees, something tall and dark. It was just a shadow, a blur in the distance, but it was enough to send a wave of icy dread crashing through me. We left that campsite in the dead of night, driving as far away as we could. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. Hours later, we didn't talk much. We didn't need to. We all knew what had happened. We all felt it, the feeling of being watched, the sense that something had been following us the whole time. To this day, none of us ever speak about it. Not in detail. At least, we don't even like to think about it. But when I close my eyes, I still hear those footsteps in the snow. I still feel those eyes on me, just beyond the trees. And every Christmas, when the snow starts to fall, I can't help but wonder what was out there in those woods. And why did it choose us? I don't think I'll ever know. But I'll never go back to those mountains. Not ever. Story number 3. The Screams of Christmas Eve. It was supposed to be a peaceful Christmas. The kind where you wake up to a blanket of snow, where the cold air feels crisp on your skin, and the crackling fire in the hearth makes you feel safe, cozy. But instead, what happened in the Olympic National Park that Christmas Eve in 1994 was something no one in my family would ever forget. It was something that would follow us, haunt us, like a shadow we could never escape. I remember it all so clearly, like it happened yesterday. My name is Nathan, and at the time, I was just a kid around 12. My sister, Sarah, was a year younger, and then there were my parents, John and Carol. We were the typical American family, always up for an adventure. My dad had promised us the kind of Christmas that would be different from any we'd ever had before. No crowded shopping malls. No family dinners at the same old relatives' houses. This year, we were going camping deep in the heart of Olympic National Park. My parents had planned the trip meticulously. As they always did, they rented a sturdy tent, packed enough gear to survive a week, and made sure to pick a remote spot in the park where there would be no distractions, no crowds, no technology, just the four of us surrounded by nature. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of purple and gold. The forest around us seemed ancient, as though it had been there long before we ever existed, and would be there long after. We set up our campsite, laughing and joking as we unloaded the car and prepared the fire. The sky was clear, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Everything felt perfect, but when night fell, something changed. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, the soft patter of rain hitting the roof of our tent. First, it was soothing, like a lullaby in the darkness. But then I heard it, something that made my blood run cold. A scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect. It wasn't a cry for help, or someone in pain. It was different, high-pitched, almost animalistic, like a woman being torn apart, but with something else layered in, something darker, something that sent a chill through my bones. I looked over at Sarah, who was still fast asleep, her face peaceful in the dim light. I turned to my parents, but they were awake too, their eyes wide in confusion and fear. "Did you hear that?" my dad whispered, barely audible over the rain. Mom nodded, her face pale. "What was that?" We all stayed silent, listening. The sound had stopped, but the air seemed thick with it, as if the scream was still hanging in the trees, reverberating in our ears. "What if someone's in trouble?" I asked, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me. "We'll check in the morning," Dad said, his voice shaky but trying to stay calm. "It's probably nothing, just an animal or someone else camping." But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The scream didn't sound like an animal, and it didn't sound like it came from someone who was just passing through the woods. The rest of the night passed in a restless silence. None of us slept much, the terror of that scream echoing in our minds. The storm raged on, the rain growing heavier by the hour. The wind howled through the trees, and I could hear branches creaking, groaning, as if the forest itself was alive. When morning came, the rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low and gray in the sky. The world felt wet and cold, as if it had been washed clean. I crawled out of the tent, rubbing my eyes, and stretched my stiff limbs. My parents were already outside, standing near the edge of the clearing, staring at something in disbelief. I walked over to them, my heart sinking as I followed their gaze. There, in the middle of our campsite, was a tent. It wasn't ours, it didn't belong to us. It was an abandoned tent, half collapsed, its poles bent and its fabric torn as if something had tried to break out from inside. The rain had soaked everything, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. The only evidence of life was the mess left inside the tent. Discarded clothes, a broken lantern, a torn sleeping bag. "What the hell happened here?" my dad muttered under his breath. We approached cautiously, stepping over the debris of the destroyed tent. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, nothing, just the eerie feeling that something had happened, something wrong, something we couldn't explain. Mom knelt down and touched the fabric of the torn tent. "This was recently used," she said. "But where did they go?" We searched the area around the campsite for hours, calling out, hoping to find some sign of whoever had been there. But there was nothing. No footprints in the wet mud. No signs of life. Not even the usual sounds of the forest. The silence was deafening. We moved deeper into the woods, hoping to find something, anything that could explain what had happened. But as the hours passed, The reality began to settle in. No one had been here for days, maybe longer. The tent, the mess inside it, it was all fresh, but whoever had been there was gone, vanished without a trace. That night, the scream came again, but this time, it wasn't distant. It was close, so close it felt like it was right outside our tent. A long, drawn-out scream, filled with terror and pain. My heart leapt into my throat, and I heard my mom gasp, her breath catching in the air. We all froze, too scared to speak, too frightened to move. The scream echoed through the trees, louder this time, as though something or someone was moving closer, drawing nearer with every passing second. And then, nothing. The silence returned, suffocating and absolute. We didn't sleep that night. We couldn't. The terror that had gripped us earlier was now a gnawing, constant presence, hanging over us like a storm cloud, refusing to lift. My parents whispered urgently in the dark, but I could hear the fear in their voices too. We all knew that something was terribly wrong, but none of us dared to speak the words. At dawn, we packed up quickly. We didn't speak, didn't make any noise as we dismantled our campsite. The once peaceful woods now felt like a trap, prison we couldn't escape fast enough. We never spoke about what happened that night again. Not to each other, not to anyone. The authorities were no help, and there was nothing they could find. No missing person report, no explanation. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. And in a way, it had. We never went back to Olympic National Park, never returned to those woods. And every Christmas since, I hear the screams again in the back of my mind, echoing in the dark corners of my thoughts, as if reminding me that the forest is never truly empty, and whatever lives in those woods, it never forgets. The scream lingers still. Story number 4. The Vanishing at Lassen. It was Christmas Eve, 2011, when I first set foot in Lassen Volcanic National Park. Along with 4 of my closest friends, we had no idea, of course, that we wouldn't make it out the same. At the time, it seemed like the perfect getaway, an adventure to remember. We were in our 20s, at the age where everything feels like it's possible, where the world is wide and untamed, and we still believed we could conquer it all. The snow had fallen lightly the day before, the air crisp with the winter chill, as we set up our tents in the dense woods, surrounded by the low hum of geothermal activity. Lassen was famous for its volcanic features, hot springs, steam vents, and fumaroles. Some called it a place of life and death, but we didn't think much about that at the time. We were a group of 5: me, Ethan, Lisa, Max, and Olivia, the usual suspects, the group that had been together since high school. We had shared everything over the years, good times, bad times, but nothing quite like this. We were young, wild, and naive. That night, we huddled around a small campfire, roasting marshmallows and talking about old times, laughing like we always did. The temperature was dropping, and we could feel the cold creeping in, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones and won't let go. After a few hours, we retreated into our tents to sleep, hoping the rain wouldn't come pouring down too hard. But rain it did. The storm broke over us in the dead of night, heavy and unrelenting, like the sky had opened its mouth and vomited the heavens onto the earth. The wind howled through the trees, sending branches cracking and creaking in the darkness. Inside my tent, the world felt far away, and I tried to sleep despite the howling wind, the thunder, and the rain pounding down on the thin fabric. I was on the edge of sleep when I heard the first strange sound. It was faint at first, a soft rustling, like someone was walking through the wet underbrush. I assumed it was just one of my friends, maybe Max or Ethan, but when I listened closer, I realized it was something different. The sound wasn't following the path of a person. It was erratic, like something shifting in the dark, moving in unnatural patterns. I lay still, straining my ears. The sound seemed to come from far off, deeper in the woods, and then I heard it again, a soft tapping, a scraping sound, like claws against the wet ground. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was just the wind, or an animal, maybe a bear or a coyote. I didn't want to wake the others for something so trivial. But then, just as I was about to drift off again, I heard something else, a voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable, a whisper. I jolted upright, my heart thundering in my chest. I listened, my breath held in the cold air. Came again low, unintelligible, but still there. The voice seemed to echo through the trees, barely a whisper carried on the wind, but something about it sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make any noise. The rain had slowed, but the wind still howled, whipping the branches around like skeletons in the dark. I stood, peering out into the blackness, shining my flashlight across the camp. Nothing. Then I noticed it, the absence. My breath caught in my throat. Max's tent was gone. It wasn't just that it was empty. No, the tent was gone. The ropes had been cut. The poles bent and snapped like they had been torn apart by something strong, something deliberate. I stepped out of the tent, heart racing. Ethan, Lisa, and Olivia were still fast asleep, unaware of the horrors unfolding just feet away from them. I glanced around, the hairs on my neck prickling. The whole campsite felt off, the air thick and stagnant, as if it had been holding its breath for far too long. I called out for Max, my voice sounding weak and fragile in the cold night. No response. I looked toward the trees, the shadows stretching long and dark in the faint moonlight. And then I heard something, another rustling sound, followed by the unmistakable crunch of something heavy moving through the wet snow. Max, I called again, this time louder, but the wind swallowed my words. The forest felt alive, as if it was watching me, listening. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow. It was fleeting, just a glimpse, something large and unnatural moving between the trees, blending into the dark. It didn't look like an animal. It didn't even look human. For a moment, I thought I saw eyes, two glinting orbs reflecting the faint light, but when I blinked, it was gone. I turned back to the camp and woke Ethan and Lisa. My voice was tight with panic as I tried to explain what had happened. I told them about Max's tent, the voice in the wind, and the shadows in the trees. Lisa was already standing, looking around with wide, frightened eyes. "What do you mean? Max is gone?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. "I heard something out there. It was like someone was walking around, but not like us. Something wasn't right." Olivia, still half asleep, groggily pulled herself out of her tent. "Max? Where's Max? We have to find him," I said. "Now." But finding him didn't feel like a choice. Felt like something we had to do, as if the forest itself was calling us to search, pulling us deeper into its dark embrace. I didn't know what I was looking for. I didn't know what I thought we'd find, but I was certain that whatever it was, we shouldn't be looking for it. We ventured into the woods, flashlights shaking in our hands, our steps unsteady in the dark. Snow-covered landscape. The wind howled louder now, the trees groaning under the weight of the storm. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the silence became. No sounds of animals, no birds calling, nothing. Then, just as I thought my sanity might shatter, we heard it, a scream, Max's voice. It echoed through the trees, raw and desperate, and it sent a shiver down my spine. But the sound wasn't quite right. It wasn't the scream of someone in pain. It was distorted, hollow, as though it were coming from a long distance, maybe even from another world entirely. We ran toward it, but with every step, felt like the scream was moving farther away. We never found Max. We searched the woods until the storm passed, but all we found were strange, unexplainable marks in the snow, footprints, human-sized, yes, but twisted, as if someone had been dragged or pulled along the ground. They led deeper into the woods, but when we followed them, they stopped, right in the middle of a clearing. There was nothing, no sign of Max, No trace of anything. When the authorities arrived the next day, they found nothing. No evidence of a struggle. No footprints to follow. It was as though Max had simply disappeared. I don't know what happened to him that night. I don't know if he was taken by something in the woods, something that wasn't quite human, or if he just ran off, scared out of his mind. But I'll never forget the look in his eyes, the way he looked at me just before he was taken. There was something hollow about it, like he had seen something in the dark that we weren't supposed to see. We left Lassen Volcanic National Park that day. We never went back, but we couldn't escape the feeling that we were still being watched. Every time I close my eyes, I can hear that scream in the wind. Every time I hear a rustle in the woods, I wonder if Max is still out there, waiting to be found. But what if he doesn't want to be found? What if he's become part of the forest, just like everything else in that cursed place? I don't know, but I can never forget, and I never want to go back. Story number 5. The Silent Snowfall. It was Christmas Eve 2007 when my life became a nightmare. When the world turned from a peaceful holiday escape into something unrecognizable. The cold Colorado air bit at my skin as my family and I set up camp deep in the heart of the Rocky Mountain National Park. My daughter, Emily, was just 12 years old, too young to understand the dangers of the wild, but old enough to want to explore it. She had always been curious, adventurous, a spark of life that I loved to watch, that I adored to protect. That night, the snow came down heavily. It was a thick, wet kind of snow, the kind that makes everything disappear. We huddled inside our tents, cozy despite the storm outside. My wife, Sarah, had prepared a simple meal, canned stew and hot cocoa, the kind of dinner you can only make when you're too far from civilization to worry about gourmet food. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and comforting, just like the home we'd left behind. We talked, we laughed, and we joked about how we'd never done anything like this before. Next year, I said, we'll make it a tradition. And Emily, with her innocent smile, had said, I'll always come with you, Dad, I promise. I should have known something was wrong, but it wasn't until the storm picked up that I began to feel that creeping unease. There was an odd kind of silence, even beneath the heavy snowfall. No animal sounds, not a single rustle of the trees. The forest was too quiet, too still, and it was as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I thought it was just the storm, the heavy snow that muffled everything. But the feeling, it never left. As the night wore on, we all fell asleep. My wife curled up beside me, her breath steady and slow, while Emily, excited by the adventure, tossed and turned in her sleeping bag across the tent. I drifted in and out of sleep, my mind half in dreams, half in the haunting quiet of the forest outside. But then, around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake. The first thing I noticed was the absence of Emily's presence. I lay still, my heart pounding. I could hear Sarah's soft breathing beside me, but Emily was gone. I shot up, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I scrambled for the flashlight. My first thought was that maybe she had gone outside, to relieve herself. But when I unzipped the tent and looked out into the heavy snow, I couldn't see anything. The snow had piled up so high that it was nearly level with the lip of the tent. The world was a blurry, silent sea of white. I called her name, softly at first, Emily, but no response came, only the wind howling through the trees, the snowflakes falling in endless sheets. Emily, I called again, louder this time, my voice thick with fear. Still nothing, just the muffled sound of the storm. I shook Sarah awake, her eyes confused and frantic when I told her that Emily was missing. She rushed outside with me, both of us shouting her name, frantically scanning the area, but it was as though the world had swallowed her up whole. The snow continued to fall, the landscape eerily still. Hours passed. We searched and searched. I combed the woods. I yelled her name until my throat felt raw. There were no footprints leading away from the camp. No sign of any struggle. Nothing. It was as if Emily had simply vanished into thin air. swallowed whole by the blizzard. The park rangers arrived the next day. They brought their dogs, their search parties, their radios. They found nothing. No trace of Emily. No sign of where she might have gone or what could have happened to her. The snow was too deep, the land too vast. Days passed, then weeks, and still, there was no sign. And then the rumors started. Some people said she had run away, that she was tired of her family, that she had just taken off, tired of the camping trip, tired of us. But I knew better than that. Emily wasn't like that. She would never run away, especially not on Christmas Eve. She loved us. She loved the adventure of the mountains, of the wilderness. Others said it was something else, that something had taken her, that the woods had claimed her. There were stories about the mountain, stories about things that lived deep in its forests, things that only came out when the snow fell, when the night was at its coldest and darkest. But there was no proof, no evidence of anything other than Emily's absence. And so, it remained a mystery. The days turned into weeks, then months. The winter gave way to spring, and still, we had nothing. We never found her. Her disappearance became a cold, painful wound that never healed. But the questions, the doubts, they lingered. Then, in December 2008, nearly a year after Emily disappeared, something strange happened. Sarah and I were sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the fire crackling in the hearth, the Christmas lights dimly flickering on the tree, when we heard it. A knock. It was light, almost tentative, like a child knocking on a door. But when I opened it, there was no one there, no footprints in the snow, nothing. And yet, when I looked down, there was something on the doorstep, a scarf. It was Emily's scarf, the one she had worn on our camping trip, the same one she had wrapped around her neck when we first set out. I picked it up, my hands shaking, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. She was gone. I looked around, but there was nothing. Only the snow, only the empty, cold night, and the scarf. That was when I started to believe in the stories, the ones about the mountain, about the things that took people, that whispered their names in the wind. Because I don't know where Emily is. I don't know what happened to her that night, or why the world took her away. But I do know one thing for sure. The mountain wasn't done with us. And as the years pass, I keep hearing the whispering of snowflakes in the wind, calling her name. But when I turn around, she's never there. Story number 6. The Inyo Forest Killer. It's Christmas Eve 1998. I'll never forget it. The night I lost everything. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Just me and Rachel, getting away from the city for a while, taking a break from the noise and the pressures of the world. A weekend in the wilds of Inyo National Forest, where the trees seemed to grow out of the earth like old sentinels, and the air smelled clean, crisp. There's a stillness in forests like that, one that makes you feel both connected and insignificant, like you're part of something much bigger than yourself. But in those same still forests, there's a darker side that most people never see. And, like I said, I'll never forget that night, because that's when everything changed. Rachel and I had driven up from LA late in the afternoon. The idea was to spend Christmas in the woods, no phone calls, no crowds, just us, a campfire, and the stars. We had everything we needed: food, blankets, a tent that could handle the winter chill, and the kind of quiet that comes only in remote places like Inyo National Forest. The night was perfect, the temperature crisp but not unbearable. We set up camp by a little creek that trickled through the forest, running clear and cold. The fire crackled between us, casting dancing shadows across the trees as we ate our simple dinner of canned chili and crackers. We talked, laughed, talked some more. Life felt easy that night, in that peaceful way that only nature can bring. Then, somewhere around midnight, the air changed. Rachel was asleep in the tent, her breathing slow and rhythmic. I sat by the fire, the embers glowing red against the black night. There was something strange about the silence. The wind had stopped, and the usual sounds of animals had gone completely still. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But when I looked around, there was nothing, just the dark outlines of trees and the whisper of the creek. That's when I heard it. A soft noise, barely audible at first. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone walking carefully through the underbrush. I froze. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, or a bear, something normal, something I'd heard plenty of times before on hikes. But there was a tension in the air that didn't feel normal. And the footsteps, they weren't like an animal's. They were too methodical, too human. I got up from my seat by the fire, straining to listen. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. I'm not sure how long I stood there, waiting, but the longer I stood, the more certain I was that I wasn't alone. I moved toward the tent to check on Rachel, my breath quickening as I neared. Then, out of nowhere, the footsteps came again, closer, faster, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where I was. I could feel the presence, like a weight pressing against me. My heart pounded as I reached for the flap of the tent. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound, a loud snap of branches behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of movement through the trees. I didn't think twice. I shoved open the tent, but Rachel wasn't there. The first thing I felt was confusion. The second was panic. Rachel was gone. The tent was empty, the sleeping bag abandoned, the door half-zipped as if she'd left in a hurry. My mind raced. Had she gone for a walk? Did she wake up and wander off into the forest? I grabbed the flashlight and called her name, my voice cracking through the stillness. Rachel? Rachel, where are you? No answer. I shouted louder, running toward the tree line. The beam of light sliced through the dark, illuminating nothing but the deep shadows of the forest. I searched everywhere I could, but she was nowhere to be found. And then I saw it, a figure in the distance, standing still just past the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. It wasn't Rachel, it was someone else, a man, dressed in dark clothing, standing motionless, watching me. I called out to him, but he didn't move. He just stood there. I don't know how long I stood there, looking at him, but finally I broke free from the trance, ran back to the camp, and grabbed the emergency radio. I needed help. I had no idea what was going on, but it was clear something wasn't right. But by the time I called for help, it was already too late. When the authorities arrived the next morning, they found Rachel's body just a few hundred yards from the camp. She was lying face up, her eyes wide open in terror. Her throat had been slit, and there were signs of a brutal struggle. And her body, well, it wasn't just the injuries that haunted me. It was the way she looked, as if she were trying to say something, as if she knew something was coming, something worse. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I wasn't the only one who had seen the man in the forest. I didn't speak much during the investigation. The officers told me to stay calm, but how could I? My wife was dead, and I was the only one left to tell the story. I could barely hold it together. The trauma was too much, too real. I couldn't even tell them everything, because part of me still couldn't believe it. The man I had seen, the man who had been standing by the edge of the forest, had disappeared before I could get a good look at him, and no one else had seen him, either. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what I found when the search party combed through the woods around the campsite. They didn't find a single trace of the killer. No footprints, no DNA, no signs of anyone else being there. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed him whole. It was as if he had never been there at all. But we knew better. Rachel's death remains unsolved. The authorities never caught anyone, never found any evidence that could point to a killer. All they found was the body cold and lifeless, as if the forest had claimed her. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is the feeling that I have, every time I close my eyes, that I'm still being watched, that the man is still out there, waiting, watching, and sometimes, I swear I hear his footsteps behind me in the silence, just the way it was that night in Inyo, waiting for me to forget. Story number 7. The Yellowstone Camp. It was supposed to be the perfect Christmas. Just the three of us. An escape into the wild. And a break from the monotonous hum of city life. Yellowstone National Park, in the heart of winter, was as far from civilization as we could get. No phones, no distractions, just the endless stretches of snow, towering pines, and the raw beauty of nature. We were ready for the isolation, or at least, I thought we were. My name's Doug. I'm the one who suggested it, and I'll be the one telling you how it all went wrong. I've always been drawn to the wild places. There's something about the solitude that gives me peace. Something about being alone, surrounded by nature, with only the sound of the wind and the crackling of a fire for company. My friends, Chris and Jenny, they felt the same way. We'd gone on a few trips before, but none like this. We'd planned it for months. Christmas at Yellowstone, camping in the wilderness, far from the chaos of our regular lives. The first day there, the weather was beautiful, a little cold, sure, but nothing we couldn't handle. We hiked out from the trailhead and found a nice spot in the backcountry, not too far from the Yellowstone River, but deep enough that we wouldn't run into other campers. We set up camp as the sun was starting to dip, the sky streaked with pink and orange. It felt like we were the only people in the world. That night, we made a fire and ate stew from a can, laughing about stupid things, trading stories, and getting excited about the next few days. We could see the stars through the trees, the vast black sky dotted with so many lights it looked like the universe was watching us. But then, just after we'd settled into our tents, the wind started to pick up. It howled through the trees like a ghost in pain. The temperature dropped sharply, and before long, snow began to fall. We were in the middle of a snowstorm, a full-blown blizzard. One of those wild Yellowstone storms that's both beautiful and terrifying. We huddled inside our tents, listening to the wind and the crackle of the fire as the snow piled up outside. Jenny couldn't sleep, so she kept asking if it was safe to stay there. But I told her it would blow over soon enough. That's the thing about the wild, you learn to roll with it. That night, as I lay there, trying to sleep, I heard something, a soft thump. It was faint at first, just a low vibration under the ground, like someone was walking nearby, but it was too steady to be the wind. My heart beat faster as I listened, straining to hear over the wind. Thump, thump, thump. I pulled myself out of my sleeping bag and crept toward the tent door, my breath visible in the cold air. I unzipped the flap just a little and peered out. Nothing. The snow had settled into a thick blanket over everything, and the only sound was the wind. Still, that thumping noise lingered in my mind. I lay back down, telling myself I was just hearing things. Maybe it was a bear or some other animal, although I knew bears didn't typically wander this close to human settlements in the winter. But it wasn't the sound of paws, no. It was something heavier, something human. I tried to sleep, but the thumping kept echoing in my mind. The next morning, we woke up to a world completely changed. The snowstorm had passed, but the landscape had transformed into a ghostly winter wonderland. There was a thick blanket of fresh snow covering everything, and the air felt dense, suffocating almost. We had planned to do some hiking, explore the backcountry, but the eerie silence outside made me hesitant. We went out anyway, pulling on layers of jackets and snow boots. The fresh snow crunched underfoot as we made our way to the area where we'd set up camp. Everything was still, too still. I scanned the trees nervously, but saw nothing unusual. Jenny tried to shake off the tension by making small talk, but I could tell she was uneasy too. Then we saw it. Around our campsite, in the untouched snow, were strange tracks. Not animal tracks, these were much too large and distinct. They were human-sized, but the prints weren't like any human tracks I'd ever seen. They were deep, almost as if someone or something had been walking heavily, but there was something off about them. The prints didn't follow any logical path, as if the person had been wandering in circles. But that wasn't the strangest part. There were no signs of anyone else being there. No movement in the trees. No sounds. Just the heavy silence of the forest. It was as if someone had walked around us, but left no trace of how they'd gotten there. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was a park ranger or another camper, just out for a walk. But even as I said the words, I didn't believe them. My gut was telling me something was wrong. That afternoon, we went back to the site to pack up. I was ready to leave. The tracks bothered me, and the sense of being watched hung over me like a thick fog. But as we prepared to leave, something strange happened. From the edge of the trees, we heard a noise. It wasn't an animal sound, it was too deliberate, too controlled. It was a rustling, followed by a soft whisper, almost like someone was talking to themselves in the distance. Jenny's face went pale. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but I didn't answer. I was afraid that if I said anything, the words would make it real. We looked into the trees, trying to pinpoint the sound, but the forest seemed to swallow the noise. Then, in a flash of movement, I saw something, a shadow, dark against the snow, darting behind a tree. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Chris, but when I turned to look at him, his face had gone ashen. "Let's go," he said, his voice tight with fear. We packed up in a hurry, barely speaking, each of us silently praying we'd get out of there without encountering whatever it was lurking in the woods. We left before the sun set. We didn't stop at the ranger station, didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't even look back. We drove in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts, unsure of what we'd seen or heard. But one thing was clear, we weren't coming back to Yellowstone. There are some places in this world where the air feels different, where the trees stand just a little too still, and the wind carries whispers on the edge of the storm. The kind of places that feel ancient and haunted, like something is watching, waiting, something that doesn't want you there. I don't know who or what was out there in the snow, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of hearing those whispers in the wind. And every Christmas since, when the snow falls thick and heavy, I remember the quiet of Yellowstone and the shadows that haunt its depths. We left the wilderness that day, but it never really left us. Story number 8. The Lost Boy of Grand Canyon. It was supposed to be the perfect Christmas getaway. A trip to the Grand Canyon, just me, my wife Karen, and our son Jeremy. The kind of Christmas you read about in magazines. The air crisp and cold, the scent of pine trees hanging thick in the air, the crackling warmth of a campfire, and the sound of nothing but nature. The kind of Christmas where families bond over stories and roasting marshmallows, where everything feels right with the world. It didn't take long for that dream to shatter. It was Christmas Eve, 1982. We had arrived at the Grand Canyon a few days earlier, eager to leave the distractions of city life behind. The trip had been Karen's idea. She had always dreamed of spending the holidays in the wilderness, far from the noise and bustle of civilization. I, on the other hand, was more of a stay-at-home kind of guy, but I went along with it. I was happy to see Karen so excited, and Jeremy, he was 8 years old then, was thrilled at the idea of being surrounded by nature, even if he didn't fully understand just how dangerous the wild could be. We set up camp near the south rim, where the cliffs stretched out like jagged teeth, biting into the sky. The weather had been cold, the kind of cold that bites at your skin and makes you think twice about leaving the tent. We spent the first few hours hiking, snapping pictures, and exploring the trails around the campsite. Everything felt normal, safe. Even when the rain began to fall in the late afternoon, we didn't worry. A little rain never hurt anyone, especially not in the canyon. That night, we huddled around the campfire. Jeremy was laughing, poking the fire with a stick, while Karen and I shared a bottle of wine. We'd eaten a simple dinner, hot dogs and beans, and the three of us had spent the evening talking about everything and nothing. It felt like one of those moments where everything falls into place and you think, this is it. This is life at its best. We didn't know that the worst was about to happen. I woke up around 4 a.m., the cold air creeping into the tent like a cold, invisible hand. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy above us, blotting out the stars. The only sound I could hear was the wind, whispering through the trees. I reached over to Karen's side of the tent. She wasn't there. My heart jumped into my throat. I wasn't a heavy sleeper, but Karen was. I quickly got up and unzipped the tent, scanning the campsite. "Karen?" I called out. There was no answer. I stepped outside, my breath fogging up in the cold air. The campfire had burned out, leaving only a pile of glowing embers. Jeremy's sleeping bag was still where he'd left it, but there was no sign of Karen. My heart started to race. Where could she have gone? I thought, maybe she went for a walk. Maybe she had gone to check on something in the dark. I started calling her name, but all I could hear was the wind rustling the trees. I searched the perimeter of the camp. Nothing. I was just about to head toward the nearby trail when I heard something. A faint rustling coming from the brush near the edge of the campsite. My heart leapt into my throat. It was Jeremy's voice. "Dad." His voice was small, but clear. He sounded confused, maybe even a little frightened. I rushed toward the sound, but when I turned the corner of the campsite, there was nothing there. No Jeremy. I froze in place, my body suddenly feeling as if it was made of stone. The wind picked up, howling in the distance, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I had no idea where my son had gone. I called his name, louder this time. "Jeremy!" The wind howled in response, but still no answer. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness, but it felt like an eternity. I had never been more afraid in my life. After what felt like hours, I finally made my way to the ranger station and reported Jeremy missing. The search began immediately, with rangers combing the area and calling in additional help. But despite our best efforts, there was no sign of him, no footprints, no clues, nothing. The rangers seemed puzzled. Maybe he wandered off and got lost. One of them said, maybe he found a cave or a shelter. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something wasn't right. Jeremy was a smart boy. He knew better than to wander off in the middle of the night. And then there was that voice, the voice I heard in the brush. The next few days were a blur of search parties, cold nights, and empty hopes. We scoured the canyon. We called in helicopters, used tracking dogs, and put up missing person reports. But Jeremy was nowhere to be found. All we found were strange things. Small, vague footprints near the edge of the campsite. Some discarded clothing, a scarf, one of Jeremy's favorite jackets, and, strangely enough, a single shoe. But no body. We were told to go home. The search had to be called off. But I didn't listen. Couldn't. Every day I woke up and looked out at the canyon, hoping to see him coming back, hoping that one of the searchers would come running back with news. But nothing. Jeremy was gone, and the only thing that remained was that chilling sense that he hadn't just disappeared. Something had taken him, something unnatural. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of what happened to Jeremy. People say kids go missing all the time in the Grand Canyon, lost to the elements, to the wild. But I know that's not true. I know what I heard that night. I know what I felt. There's something in that canyon, something that doesn't want to be found. And maybe, just maybe, is still there, waiting for the next family to stumble into its grip. The Grand Canyon is a beautiful place, but there are secrets hidden in its shadows, secrets that don't belong to the earth. And I'm sure of one thing. It wasn't the wind that called Jeremy's name that night. It was something much darker,